Hello! Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Hello and welcome to another pulse-pounding episode of Cinelit. Today we are casting our eyes back in the second of our series looking at Hammer horror. Previously we've tackled the run of Frankenstein films, and today we sink our fangs into the Dracula series. Joining me on today's podcast are my fellow creatures of the night, Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
I'm good, thanks, Adam. Just back from a horror film festival, actually, so all raring to go on this and all vampired up at the moment.
And we're also joined again by Hammer experts and the main force behind the encyclopedia of fantastic film and television, Kevin Lyons. How are you, Kevin?
I'm very well, thank you. Very much looking forward to this one.
Okay, well, let's jump straight in then. There's a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 films. Is that right? Like miscounted there?
Yeah, depending on which ones you include and which you don't, really. Yep. Yes, yeah. Yeah, Hammer made a lot of films with the word Dracula in the title and nothing to do with the Dracula series.
Dracula's in the title, but rarely in the film. Yeah.
Well, I've only included one in today's list. I mean, I haven't included Countess Dracula, but I have included The Brides of Dracula. So we will be looking. So we're looking at some of those sidebars, but not all of them. I think if we did all of them, we'd be here all week. So let's try and streamline it a little bit. So we're going to look at, first off, let's look at the first film, Dracula, 1958. The first film, but in a sense, a follow-up to the massive success of The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957. Really, that two-shot film hit established Hammer on the world stage as a force to be reckoned with. And and here we are with this one where colour brings the claret to life, I guess. There's nothing more evocative in this film than the scenes of blood being spilled.
Indeed, it's one of the first things we see, isn't it, on the title sequence? The title sequence is Dracula's name on the coffin and this spattering of Kensington gore. So they set out their stall very early, right at the very... You're under no illusion about what this film's going to be once it started.
Was this the first colour Dracula?
I think it was, yes.
I think so.
I can't think of an earlier one.
Good question.
Well, it's for an expert beyond our skills, but as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know,
it is. It's certainly the first one to show Dracula sporting fangs. He'd never worn them before in film, so this was the first time we saw that. So this is where the sort of the real image. I know, I can feel the Bela Lugosi fans bristling from here, but for me, this is where the real sort of image of Dracula comes from. When I think of Dracula, I think of Christopher Lee and the cape and the fangs and that's the image in my mind rather than Lugosi. He was great, but this is where it all starts for me.
There's a dynamism to this role rather than like Lugosi's much more theatrical stage kind of presence.
Yeah. I think that stems a lot from the script. The whole movie and all of the characters are sort of dynamic. Lee is fantastic and really sort of feral in this, but also aristocratic and sophisticated as well. He really gets that balance. I think a lot of the film's dynamism comes from the script, and I'm not sure if it was Richard Matheson who said this some years later when he was called upon to write a version of Dracula in the 70s. It may have been Mathis, it may be someone else. Kevin, you might know this, but there was a quote talking about doing an authentic version of Bram Stoker's novel, and whoever it was that said it said, well, you can't, because it would be basically a 6-hour film of people writing letters and putting entries in their diary, you know, because the novel is all sort of letters and notes and sort of diary entries and so on. Now, what happens here is we've got Jimmy Sangster, who sort of throws the book away, takes the absolute bare bones of it, and just makes it into this fabulous sort of confrontation come chase movie. And we did a podcast on Mad Max recently, and this is like the Mad Max of the you know, it's the Mad Max approach to Bram Stoker.
It's beautifully streamlined, isn't it, the script? I mean, all that toing and froing backwards and forwards between Whitby and the continent, all that's gone. He just sets it all in the one location. There's one bride, which, okay, that would have been, you know, budgetary restraints, but it's streamlined, it's sleek, it's beautiful, wonderfully. It's not the most faithful adaptation of Dracula, but I do think it's probably the best, to be fair. I think it really gets to the essence of the book more than most.
Exactly, yeah. In terms of being, you can be faithful, and then you can be sort of true to the book, I think. And they're two different things. And this is, I think Bram Stoker would have loved this film.
Oh, yes, I think so. Yeah, I think this really sort of cuts to the heart of what the book's about. And what you were saying earlier about Lee being sort of aristocratic, and there's an arrogance to him, and a sort of, you know, he oozes this sort of power, this sort of sexual power and this sort of actual power. I've talked about this so many times, but one of my favorite scenes in the film is one of those that nobody talks about because it's just a throwaway scene, but it's beautiful, it's perfect. When he first meets Harker in the castle, and he takes his bags, just lifts them up effortlessly, walks up the stairs 2 steps at a time while Harker scurries after him 1 step at a time. This guy is so powerful and so confident about himself, so confident in his undead body that he just strides manfully up the stairs, leaving this poor mere mortal scurrying in his wake. It's a wonderful shot, really clever stuff.
Yeah. Of course, audiences at the time would have marvelled at that, because they'd have realised this is the same actor who we saw last year playing Frankenstein's monster. Right. And as we described in our Frankenstein podcast, he gives this great sort of mime performance of a monster who's sort of learning how to live again and learning how to use his limbs. And here's the complete opposite of that from the same guy.
Yeah, it shows his extraordinary range, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we get a full reuniting of cast and crew on this practically. And you got Terence Fisher in the director's chair. You've got Jimmy Sangster screenwriting as well, and you've got Peter Cushing and Lee as the antagonist and protagonist again. You know, but in a very different world.
It was like this little family unit that they got going on at Bray at the time, and I think that's a huge part of the success of these films. That they got this little family unit, which was running like clockwork. They all knew each other. I mean, after just one film, they all knew how each other worked. And that shows in all those early Hammer films. It sort of cheapens it to say that it was like a production line, because that makes it sound very mechanical, but it kind of was. They just came in with the script and they just did it. And it was so ruthlessly efficient.
Yeah.
And, you know, they cranked these things out, but they did it in so much style.
I think it's one of those things where they create such an atmosphere of being able to do these confidently and quickly that it allows things like Christopher Lee striding up the stairs 2 steps at a time.
Yeah.
Something like that might have been missed in a more sort of like unsure production. But they're so confident, the crew's going to think about those things.
I mean, I don't know who came up with it. Was it in the script? I don't know. Was it Fisher? Was it Lee? I don't know. But you kind of get the impression that the atmosphere on the set was such that someone like Lee could say, let's try this. And Fisher would go, yeah, all right, I trust you. You know, you've done well. You did really well in the last film. I now trust you. And that you see that developing as the early Hammers go along. You see this kind of slightly experimenting, and you kind of wonder how much the actors and the director put into the scripts when they were actually on the set. You know, was there a little bit of leeway perhaps?
Maybe. I was thinking about people that are making horror films in England today, and a lot of it, as we know, is very, very low budget or even no budget production. It's basically people going out at weekends and making films with their mates. But Hammer are almost a template for that. They are. It's a place where people make making films with their friends. You know, but with budgets and with the opportunity to release them on the cinema circuit,
yeah.
which today's filmmakers don't have. But yeah, the sort of spirit was identical, I'm sure.
And that's when you can make a really good film really quickly, is when you're all pulling in the right direction and everybody sort of believes in each other. And I think Hammer fostered that so well, very, very quickly, right at the very beginning.
So what's the standout in this film? Obviously, Lee is magnetic in the role, but again, Cushing
is amazing. I mean, I'm slightly biased here. He's my favorite actor of all time, but he's so, he was him that came up with that ending. That, the leaping across the table and tearing down, because, he famously said he felt like he was just a crucifix salesman, that he was just going to whip out a crucifix and do his whole shtick again. He said, why can't I just run across the table and pull the curtains down? So, he brings a dynamism to Van Helsing that we'd never seen.
We mentioned when we did our David Lean podcast recently that the set of Great Expectations is not dissimilar to that room, and all hinges on a pair of curtains being pulled and the sunlight sort of streaming through the dust.
Indeed, yes.
I wonder if Peter had got that in mind when sort of looking at the set at Bray and thinking, can we do this?
Well, Cushing was really famous, wasn't he? For he was he known as Props Peter or something? He was really sort of Peter. Famous for knowing where every prop was on the set. And if you see the annotated copies of his scripts, he's actually got notes, pen over here, he's a cup over there. And
he gets to use some wonderful ones here as well. Like there's the sort of old-fashioned recording device,
which of course the throwback to the novel, of course, where you were saying earlier that there were phonogram recordings in there, so there's a little sort of throwback to that as well.
Well, people forget about the novel, that it was set in the modern day.
Of course, it was.
It was set at the time it was written.
Yeah,
we see it as a period piece, but
it never was. No, it was always meant to be very. It was a bit like Sherlock Holmes. They were always meant to be very, very modern pieces, but they've just become sort of cozy period pieces for us now. So
Peter Cushing, obviously, it adds an air of confidence. Knowing all those props where they are, it exudes through his acting style of utilising the props in playing confident characters.
It's fascinating. If people listening haven't noticed this before, go and watch some Peter Cushing films and watch him working the props. It's absolutely fascinating. It's never distracting because it feels so natural. It feels like the sort of thing people would do, but he's always doing something. He's always fiddling with something or picking something up or putting it in his pocket or taking it out of his pocket. And he just adds that. Yes, like you said, there's sort of like he's got the confidence to do that, because he understands his character really, really well. And that's one of the things I absolutely love about his performances.
Sure. My favourite scenes with him in the film are not the ones where he's confronting Dracula or the ones where he's talking to the members of the household and explaining things to them. They're the ones where he's engaging with the child star, Yanina Faye. He's so good with her and really takes his time to give her a bit of screen time as well. And I just love those scenes.
And when you look at it, he doesn't have a lot of screen time with Lee. But when they do come together, it's like alchemy, isn't it? I mean, it's just something about the two of them together in the same frame. There's just something, even now, I'm a knackered old man of 59 and I still get a little buzz when I see the two of them in the same frame on a film after all these decades of watching them, Absolutely staggering performances.
It's an interesting thing. You talk about like screen time, shared screen time. Just after obviously with the Frankenstein one a few months, like last month, and Cushing is pretty much front and center for most of that franchise. He's on screen the most. In this franchise, it's a complete different. Lee's barely in the franchise. His own franchise. He's screen time wise. He's barely in it.
Well, I think this was a bit of a bone of contention for him at times, wasn't it? He often sort of said, they've given me like 3 words in the entire film. A lot of fans I know are unhappy about the fact that he doesn't appear a lot in the films. In some ways, I kind of like it. There's that kind of sort of presence in the background, this evil that's there in the background, stalking the film. And when he does appear, he's just magnificent. I think if you'd put him in too much, he might have just worn off a little bit. It's just when you finally do see him, it's a real chill down the spine, It's just wonderful. Just in the first film, for example, his few appearances, he gets more appearances here than in all the other films, but you'll suddenly get that moment where he suddenly appears in the doorway when the bride is trying to attack Harker. And it's such a shock because we'd almost kind of forgotten he was in it for a minute because we were so concentrating on Harker and the Bride, and we hadn't seen Dracula for a little while. And then suddenly he's in the doorway, blood all over his lips and dripping from his fangs and snarling. It's absolutely electrifying. Would it have worked if he'd been in it a lot more? I don't know. But, by having him skulking around the edges, that's the Dracula I like. He's skulking around the edges, just doing unspeakable things.
Yeah, I mean, he's the bad guy. I mean, there's
the bad guy.
1950s, 60s. Yeah, you don't get movies about bad guys, and they are the bad guys. So there's no reason why he should be front and center.
There was always some. I think we mentioned this in the podcast about Frankenstein, that there was always some sort of ambiguity as whether Frankenstein was really a villain. Was he just a bit misguided? Was he nuts? Was he, I don't know. There's never any doubt about Dracula. Dracula is an evil so-and-so from the very first film right through to the very last. There's no messing about with that. He's horrible. None of these sort of, sparkly vampire stuff and, falling in love and all the rest of it and sort of pursuing people and pursuing lost loves across time. This man's a monster. He's a parasite and it's brilliant. More like that, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to talk about future vampire movies. How big of an influence do you think on modern vampire movies this has had? Because it's very much obviously a period setting, or now is a period setting, but it's got like gothic tradition that it's drawing upon. And you don't see much of that in modern horror films now.
Sadly not, no. I'd like to see more Gothic, I think, in modern films. But of course, it's expensive or relatively expensive to do Gothic. You need to do costumes and sets and all the rest of it. So whether it's still an influence on, sort of current filmmakers doing vampire films, I don't know. It's a difficult one to answer that because they all seem to be very contemporary sets.
Yeah, I think the one indication of that in the 21st century has been the return of Hammer films in name at least, and the handful of films that we've had. There's been nothing like that Family Unit. There's been nothing like the Conveyor Belt. We're lucky to get a film once every 3 or 4 years. We've had this handful of films since about 2008, and I think when it was announced that Hammer were coming back, the fans were all obviously very, very excited, and I think a lot of them were anticipating a new wave of Gothic, and it simply never happened.
No. Well, they've kept up the vampire thing. They did Let Me In, and that's great. But they've sort of moved with the times. I don't know.
And even Beyond the Rave is a vampire movie.
Of course, the less said about that, the better. But it is a vampire movie. Yeah. But it just seems like Gothic has fallen out of fashion. I'd hoped that the sort of love it or loathe it, sort of Gatiss and Moffat Dracula, that's at least 2/3 Gothic. I kind of hope that might have triggered a few copycats, but it hasn't. Sadly, it's still very.
No, all that seemed to happen with that was that the third part was set in modern dress, and all people like us and the people we know all sort of complained about it. And
I didn't mind the first 2 episodes. The last one, not another modern day vampire film. Come on.
Yeah.
I think it's tricky to put it. I mean, even though Hammer have got that history and that tradition, you're not going to reinvent anything.
No.
But when did Hammer actually launch this wave of Gothic? 1956, 57, where what's happening in the rest of the world is the teenagers being born. Everyone's interested in Elvis Presley and Little Richard, and the space race is sort of building up and just sort of in its early stages. And there's all kinds of exciting things going on in the world. And so Hammer somehow managed to launch this series of adaptations of sort of old properties and old novels and old treatments, and yet make it fit in with all that excitement that's going on elsewhere in the world, that seems to be changing the world, And so I think that's a sign it can be done again.
It is slightly odd, isn't it, that they'd sort of had their earlier successes with the very contemporary Quatermass films, and you kind of felt like that was probably the way they were going to go forward.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, out of the blue, they do Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula virtually back to back, and like you say, he just came out of nowhere. It didn't seem to fit with to use that word, the zeitgeist. It didn't seem to fit, did it? You know, the world was
No.
changing, and yet here were Hammer sort of taking us back to an older tradition.
Yeah, and the whole path changes then for the next 15 years or so for the company, and again, right in the middle of the swinging 60s, they're still doing it.
They're still at it, yeah.
And so much so to the point where they're actually parodied by Roman Polanski, by the Carry On team, and by other people.
Indeed.
You know?
But I think the original the original handful of the late 50s, early 60s, they, even though they were adaptations of classic texts and they were Gothic tradition and drawing on that Grand Guignol kind of history, they were bloody and violent for the time. That was cutting edge and was fresh and was new.
That was the thing.
I think that was the rock and
that was the rock and the sex, of course. You know, I mean, to our eyes, it looks very, very tame indeed. But you know, imagine a 1958 audience going in to see Dracula and seeing The Bride. You know, she was showing off a lot more than you expected from a young lady in a film at that time. And she was trying to bite a young man. You know, this was very sexy stuff that had never been seen in sort of British horror, certainly at that point. So yeah, I mean that was part of it. All those elements, I'm sure the younger audiences absolutely lapped that stuff up. This was great. This was stuff that, you know, Mum and Dad would have heard of Dracula and Frankenstein. And then they said, oh, yeah, go and see Dracula and Frankenstein. When everybody turned up, there was like, hang on a minute, this isn't the Dracula and Frankenstein I remember. There's eyeballs everywhere and there's fangs and blood. And so, you know, the kids would have loved that because it's like, stitched up Mum and Dad, isn't it? You know, so you can see where they were quite canny with that. I think they sort of managed to sort of put one foot in both camps, you know. It's very clever. They were very canny people behind Hammer. They knew what they were doing.
And they had a massive success. To follow on that, you know, they knew what they were doing. They had a massive success, and then waited 8 years before they brought Christopher Lee back to the role of Dracula.
They didn't always know what they were doing. Okay, I'll take it back. They didn't always know what they were doing. Hammer became bigger than its stars. And that was a key to their success, you know, that they could chop and change things about a little bit because it was the Hammer name that really made them. And so when they did the follow-up to Dracula, it wasn't a Dracula film despite the title. It was a Van Helsing film. And so, you know, Brides of Dracula in 1960, it was Van Helsing. Dracula's not in it at all. You know, you see him very briefly in a sort of rehash of the ending scene from Dracula. And then we're off onto one of his acolytes, which... It's not clear at this stage now whether that was a conscious decision to get rid of Lee or whether Lee said, no, I'm not going to do any more Dracula. Nobody really knows at this stage. It could be any number of reasons, really.
Maybe Jimmy Sangster just had no idea how to bring him back.
Yeah. I mean, at that time, he was like, were people even aware that you could bring a vampire back to life? You know, he was probably one of those things they thought, oh, well, he's dead now. He's never come back before in other films. So... how do we bring him back? And, you know, so, yeah, they went off and did something completely different, just taking the Dracula name in vain.
I mean, it just become a part of the franchise. Like, how are they going to bring him back next? You know, for each successive film, what's the resurrection scene going to be like? It's like
we've seen that since with Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger, right up to date in film series today.
Yeah.
You know? But yeah, I think Hammer were one of the sort of companies that really sort of established that sort of tradition in horror that you could have a franchise and you could bring your dead characters into another film. You know, but Brides of Dracula is interesting as a little bridge because it seems to be a bit of a stopgap in a sense when we look at it from today's perspective. But it's also probably the best of the series.
Oh yeah. One of Hammer's absolute finest films. It's magnificent.
Yeah. One of the most modern in its modern sensibilities as well. Bizarre.
It is. Yeah. It's the one I think that you could probably show to a younger audience first. You know, that they probably get into it a little bit easier, perhaps. And it's dated less than some of the later films in the series, which we'll come to in a moment, some of which now look positively archaic. But this one looks, like you say, very, very modern.
There is a young cast in the movie. You know, the sort of stars of the film are younger actors, although I think David Peel looks younger.
He was older
about 40,
in real life, yes.
Yeah. But he fits in with that rock and roll teenage sort. He's got that sort of appeal, you know, in the way he's presented. Cushing's there as this rock again, you know, as Van Helsing, the sort of hub round which it all revolves. But the two best performances are from people that again were in Great Expectations, weirdly enough. Frida Jackson and Martita Hunt, who absolutely steal the film.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you know, poor old Peter Cushing signed up to be the star of the film, and everybody still to this day talks about those two. You know, and Cushing is magnificent. Don't get me wrong, Cushing is magnificent. But yeah, those two. There's a couple of scenes. Everybody knows which scenes we're talking about, which just stick it out in the mind. I don't want to spoil anything for those who haven't seen it, because I know there are going to be people out there who've never seen Brides of Dracula. Go watch it. You are in for such a treat. You really are. And then when you come back to listen to this afterwards, you'll think, now I know which two scenes he's talking about. Yeah.
But yeah, I agree, Kevin. I think, you know, if anyone was to ask me, you know, which Hammer film should I watch first if I've never seen any, I'd say start somewhere near the top and start with Brides of Dracula, because you get everything in that movie. Bar Christopher Lee, you get everything in this film that is what Hammer is all about.
They kind of hit a peak, didn't they? A very early peak with this. Like you say, the only downside is that Lee's not in it. We can live with that because the rest of it.
But again, he's there as that lurking presence you mentioned,
isn't he? Yeah.
We're told at the start of the film. I think almost the very first line on the narration is Count Dracula is dead.
Yeah.
But there's this sense, and the sort of intonation in the narrator's voice sort of suggests that maybe not for long, folks. You know. His influences around.
Well, to come right up to date, he's a little bit like a virus, isn't he? He's in the background, infecting everything, you know, even though he's not on screen. This is
that's sort of what this film becomes about. It's Dracula's influence, and how he's almost more terrifying when he's not there than when he is, because there is this sense that he's, even though he's dead, even though we've seen him die in the previous film, there's still this sort of pervasive influence out there, and it's infecting.
And you can't help but think that he created one monster in Baron Meinster. How many more has he created? How many more Baron Meinsters are there out there in the Hammerverse that we never actually saw? You know?
That could have easily been the route that this franchise took.
It could,
again, a la the Frankenstein films. You know, the Frankenstein films are about Baron Frankenstein, and we get a different monster in each one. Who's to say that the Dracula films might not have followed this line and had a different lead vampire in each one?
I mean,
but of course he didn't, because, you know, they got Christopher Lee back in the end. So
Cushing is, even though the movie is stolen away from him by what people have been talking about, Cushing is great, and there's a handful of things in this movie that are really unique in the series. I think the obviously I'm going to go into spoiler territory because I don't care, but we got the scene where he actually gets bitten. And he cauterizes the wound with the branding iron and uses the holy water.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
We talked on the Frankenstein podcast, and it's a regular discussion among Frankenstein fans about, can you call is the monster called Frankenstein or not? You know, and that's a whole other debate. This sort of leans into that sort of territory, because suddenly Van Helsing's a vampire.
Yes.
For a few seconds.
He becomes the very monster he's been trying to find. And although, you know, I'm never quite sure of the biology of cauterizing a vampire wound, that doesn't matter. It's the performance. He sells it so beautifully. There's a look of panic in his eyes at first when he realizes what's happened, and then this steely sort of determination that Cushing did so well when he decides this is what he's going to do, and he sells the agony of that. It's an unbearable scene. It's actually really difficult to sit through because it's really, really well done.
It is. What do we think about Van Helsing in terms of comparison with Frankenstein? Because we talked about Baron Frankenstein as being this very sort of ambiguous character who is cold, ruthless, and evil, but helps the homeless and helps the poor, and has this sort of dual life going on. Now, Van Helsing's almost like that in that he's the opposite of Frankenstein, but he's very similar to him in that he's totally for good, he's totally for wiping out evil, but in taking that to an absolute obsession, beyond obsession, sort of, there's a little hint of that sort of mental illness that we see in Baron Frankenstein. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yes, he's just as driven as Van Helsing, and in some ways he's probably almost as dangerous, because I mean, certainly to himself, he puts himself on the line, particularly in this film, far more than he really should have done. But yeah, I think his obsession, that is the word. I think both of those characters were obsessed with something, and the Frankenstein's obsession was a little bit more of nihilistic and a little bit more sort of self-centered. It was all about him and all about, I think Van Helsing is obsessed, but genuinely believes that he's doing good, that he's fighting the good fight.
But then doesn't Frankenstein?
Doesn't Frankenstein think that? Yes, he probably does. I think it's more obvious to our eyes that Van Helsing is fighting the good fight than it is with Frankenstein. I think we can look at Frankenstein and think, well, you may think you are, mate, but seriously, you're not. But I think with Van Helsing, he's much more of a clear-cut character. He's definitely the hero of the films.
And
that
he's on our side, whereas Baron Frankenstein isn't.
Yes.
But there's not a lot of space between.
No, exactly. No, they are very much two sides of the same coin, to coin a cliche.
I think they are, but I do think that the difference is the power, is what power they wield. And I think Frankenstein wields the power, whereas Van Helsing is fighting the power. He's trying to drag a mere mortal back up to that level, where the power is. And I think that's the subtle differences. And I think that's why maybe as the series goes on, he's less powerful in himself, because it's just not as
maybe what we needed here, and how they would have done it, I don't know, is a Van Helsing versus Frankenstein movie.
In an alternate universe that exists, and I'd have been first in the queue for that.
You can see the poster now.
We've talked about one of the films that doesn't include Dracula quite a long time now. I think just a little note on Yvonne Fleur in this film as well, because she does what pretty much no other heroine in any of the Dracula films does something. She actually has agency in her own savior, whereas the rest of them tend to be saved or bitten. So, but let's move on to Dracula, Prince of Darkness, which is the return of Christopher Lee, and what a return! What a great resurrection scene! Yeah,
fantastic resurrection scene.
Yeah, when Eli Roth made Hostel in 2005, and a lot of traditional horror fans didn't like it and said, "Oh, we don't like this." It was branded under this phrase "torture porn," wasn't it? Yeah. And I think it was Quentin Tarantino, Eli's great friend and mentor, who pointed out it's basically got the plot of a Hammer Dracula movie, and I think this is very close to that, where you've got this setup where 4 people go on holiday. They sort of wander into the wrong place, and they get tortured and killed. And that's the plot of Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and it's the plot of Hostel.
I'd never thought of that, but that's really good. I'd never considered that. I'm going to have to go away and think about that one.
Yeah. But what we get on top of that is a film rooted in Hammer Gothic, and it's a fine follow-up. If you had to have a follow-up to Dracula, and again, I'm sure people in 1965 were complaining about sequels just as people do today, and here's a sequel that comes along and destroys that argument, because it's fantastic.
I'm not quite as sold on it as a lot. I know it's got a huge amount of fans, and I have got into trouble in the past by not being entirely committed 100% to it. I don't hate it. I don't think it's a bad film. I just think it's one of those films that really is living in those twin shadows of Dracula and Bride of Dracula. And yes, comparisons are odious, but in this case, you can't really help it. And it's a really, really good film. It's just not Dracula. It's a bit like, sort of when I talk to people about, 2010, and I say, look, it's the sequel to my favourite film, the greatest film ever made. And in that respect, it's an utter failure. On its own, it's actually quite a good film. But it's just living in this incredibly dark shadow. And I find that a little bit with Prince of Darkness, that it's kind of, it just wasn't Dracula, and I wanted it to be Dracula. I wanted to have that same feeling that I had when I saw Dracula.
Dracula doesn't even come on screen until over halfway through it. Yeah. But I think that first half of the movie is terrific. I think the scene setting is great. We really get to know the four characters.
Yeah.
We meet Andrew Keir as the wonderful
Yes.
Father Sandor.
Yeah.
The lovely scene. Barbara Shelley's performance is terrific all the way through, because she actually changes and has this weird sort of enforced character arc, you know. And when she's very prim and proper early in the movie, there's this wonderful moment where Andrew Keir comes into the tavern where they're all sort of resting and drinking, and he's this sort of religious figure, but you can tell he's also a bit rough and ready as well, and he's prepared to go out and fight. In the absence of Van Helsing, he's the guy who's going to go out and fight the evil, and he sort of comes in and immediately lifts up his cassock or whatever it is he's wearing and starts warming his arse by the fireplace.
Yeah.
And the look on Barbara Shelley's face in the background is sort of nose in the air, you know, sort of absolutely aghast and appalled at what she's seeing.
Terribly English response.
And so I think there's a lot of things like that in the first half of the movie that really do help to set the tone and set the characters. And again, as we've said previously, the fact that Dracula isn't there doesn't really
no, not at all. No.
Enhances them.
And you know, you're talking about Barbara Shelley. I mean, you know, we really need to wax lyrical for several days about Barbara Shelley and this performance in particular, which is for me the single best thing about this film. As I'm speaking, I have the still in front of me that I used in my review of her being held by the monks, and she's gone from this prim, very proper, very English young lady into this feral, snarling monster. All of it under the curse of this monster that is lurking around the background of the film. You know, we actually see the sort of the horror that Dracula brings to the world through her more than we see through him.
And it's through her change.
That's right.
You know, because we've got to know this incredibly. She's sort of an English Rose character, but she's also a sort of schoolboy.
That's right, a little bit uptight,
very, very straight. And we've got Susan Farmer along for the ride, who's a much more frivolous, much more sort of fun character. And they're sort of brought together because they're married to two brothers.
That's right,
And you do get the sense that they might not even like each other all that much, although that's never really played on. And then suddenly Barbara turns into this wild animal. And her movements in the big scene where we see her as a vampire about to be staked, the way she moves in that scene, the physicality of it is better than Christopher Lee. I mean, Lee, of course, does it across a series of films. She has this sort of 2-minute showcase. I think she's the great screen vampire there. Also, of course, what we get is, it's a bit difficult to say this because of the tightness of the camera angle, but I think that we get a scene with Barbara Shelley that anticipates the famous moment of the boy at the window in Salem's Lot 15 years later. Because she appears at Susan Farmer's window while Susan Farmer's in bed, and I don't think Susan Farmer's sleeping on the ground floor.
I don't think she. I think you're right. I think she's upstairs.
And nobody's ever really commented on that.
Really
Watching
subtle.
the film again recently, I thought, Barbara's actually flying.
Here, I'm going to go back and watch it. And you've managed to persuade me to go back and watch Dracula Prince of Darkness. Well done, Al. Fantastic.
My work here is done.
And of course, you know, you were saying about how prim and proper she was and how Suzanne Farmer is much more of a sort of frivolous, much more happy-go-lucky character. So, of course, Dracula wasn't interested in her.
Of course not,
He wanted the uptight, he wanted the sexually repressed one because he wanted to release that.
Corrupting somebody who's already halfway there isn't any fun.
That's no fun at all, is it? No, so he wanted the one who was going to be the hardest to turn, the hardest to convert into his monster. And so, of course, he goes for the one that's, and she's very sexually repressed at the beginning, and then it all comes out. And, you know, we might argue that, they've unleashed this, sort of feminine sexuality and it's highly destructive, and there's a whole sort of, there's a whole podcast to be gone into there. But I think they do it incredibly well with this, that this is what Dracula was after. He was after the corruption of the most innocent of them all.
Yeah, yeah, and of course we get the famous scene from Stoker where when he finally does confront Susan Farmer and sort of try to lure her into his fold, the famous scene of Dracula cutting his own chest open so that she can drink from it, and they are interrupted, luckily, but or unluckily, depending on what you want from the film. But yeah, there's a chance to shoehorn a little bit of Stoker in, which must have pleased Lee. There's a couple of male performances in the film that I think are extraordinary. Our old pal Thorley Walters from a couple of the Frankensteins. He's occasionally accused of being a little bit of a bumbling sort of Nigel Bruce type figure, and he often is in films. I think his Renfield-like character in this film is extraordinary because he does that bumbling routine, but his character's doing it as a means to an end. He's pretending to be a bumbling old fool to get what he wants. I think it's a brilliant take on his sort of cliched persona. The key male performance for me, though, is Francis Matthews, who gets all sorts of business here. He does comedy. There's this dialogue about this ex-boyfriend of his wife's, Horace Peabody, and they have this wonderful little comic routine there. But then there's the great scene where he discovers his brother's body, and it's brilliantly handled by Terence Fisher because it's in this. It's not in a coffin. It's in this almost like this shoebox sized, almost like a little treasure chest thing. And we're thinking, surely there can't be a human body in there. And Francis Matthews does the really stupid thing and opens it to have a look, and we don't see it. But we see what he sees. We see the look on his face and the performance. The range he gives in this movie is just so impressive. And again, I've never seen him perform like that in a film or a TV show before.
Well, I think outside Hammer circles, he's actually very underrated as an actor. I'm quite the fan, but you never see him get spoken about outside of Hammer circles. You never see him get the love that he deserves. Maybe Jerry Anderson circles.
Yeah. He's seen as being Mr. Suave normally. He's one of those guys who looks good. He'd have made a good James Bond, maybe. He looks good in a tuxedo and a bow tie and with a glass of champagne. But here, I think Fisher and the script really give him something to if you'll pardon the pun, get his teeth into. Yeah.
I'm not convinced, Darryl. I'll be honest. I'm not convinced. I think he's very good, but I think the script gives him stupid things to do, and the script in the first half has things that, for me, make me feel like they're idiots. Like, for instance, opening coffin there. You don't do it. The coach arrives driven by nobody. The coach arrives driven by nobody with an infernal sort of like horses at the front, and they all just climb in. That's like
but it's to make the comparison again, though, Adam. It's what the characters in Hostel do. It's these films are saying, yes, Brits abroad or young Americans abroad do dumb things. And
should have known better by Hostel, at least.
But it's a commonplace, isn't it, in horror films?
Well, that's what
if people didn't go back for the cat, horror films would work. People are always doing dumb things in horror films. And it's whether or not the writer and director can make you suspend that little bit of disbelief and say, oh, all right, they're being idiots. No one goes back into the Amityville house just because the dog's in there. That you get out of there the minute the first creepy thing happens and you flee and you leave the dog behind. But no, we're going to go back because a little bit of unintentional, all the rest of it. If you can buy that, if they can sell it to you, then it works. I always found a lot of the slasher movies, I was sort of sitting there screaming at the screen, for God's sake, you bloody morons, what are you doing? Just go, leave now. You've got a chance, just leave, But it's just a commonplace in horror films. I think characters have to do things that in real life we would not do at all.
No, I agree, but I think with following Brides and following Dracula, where there's a lot less of that. Characters doing stupid things because the plot needs to do a stupid thing.
I totally agree with you. I think there is that problem in there, but I think, it's worth pointing out that, other horror films were doing it at the time. They did it before. They'll do it in the future. There will always be at least one idiot in every horror film who does something that just drives you mad.
Talking about film franchises, what we get here, of course, is the first revival of the Hammer Dracula, which is an extraordinary sort of and almost an anti-religious scene, almost a sort of inverted cross-like scene. It's quite extraordinary, quite blasphemous in parts. And then of course we get the first new death of Dracula. Having revived him, Hammer then tell us, you can kill a vampire once, you can keep killing him. And these are the two things that we get that are new to this series in this.
And that, I think, was part of the attraction for fans at the time, even now perhaps, that how are they going to do it? How are they going to bring him back? They killed him at the last one. He went under the water, under the ice. He's dead. Well, he's dead. How do we get him back from here? So people, I think, went to the next film partly thinking, how are we going to see him come back? How are they going to do this?
And across the series, the continuity is actually rather good, isn't it? They don't forget from film to film how they kill.
They don't, but don't try working out the dates. The dates will drive you completely insane.
So
they simply don't fit.
Moving on to the next one, guys. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave is next, and another success, I think. Particularly box office.
Well, I've just said how blasphemous the resurrection of Dracula is in Dracula Prince of Darkness. And again, people that haven't seen it, go and find out for yourselves. And I think the whole of Dracula Has Risen from the Grave is very interesting in the way that it flips religion over, so that we've got an atheist hero and we've got a priest as Dracula's servant in this one.
Yeah.
So. What am I saying about religion here?
Yes, exactly. And, again, it's what would you expect from Dracula other than to go after a priest? I mean, that's going to be...
Again, it's a challenge again, isn't it?
If he can't get the town virgin, he's going to go for the priest, isn't he? Because, that's what he is. If he can corrupt the local priest, that will strike terror into the hearts of the neighborhood.
Which in this film it does, of course, because famously the shadow of Dracula's castle falls across the church, which means nobody uses it. Which also means that there's right at the start of the film there's a big surprise, and again we won't reveal it, but there's a big surprise in the church bell. So.
We haven't mentioned yet that this was actually a new director. This was Freddie Francis. Terence Fisher had moved on to other things, and now we've got Freddie Francis, who was, of course, a cinematographer, an absolutely brilliant cinematographer, possibly the best this country's ever produced. And this was his, his Dracula film, and he has a habit of bringing with him from The Innocents. He brought some color filters, which I find slightly distracting after a while, because every time Dracula appears or every time something spooky is about to happen, you get this kind of red-rimmed sort of thing.
There's this halo around the
you think, something spooky is going to happen. It kind of robs it a little bit of the suspense, I find. But when you first see them, they're very effective. When you first see Dracula framed in that, it adds a real sort of frisson to it. Francis, master cinematographer, the lighting in this film is absolutely unparalleled. It's like he had his director of photography, but I'm pretty sure he was behind the camera on the lights most of the time, sort of saying, no, don't do that, do this, and who was going to argue with Freddie Francis?
Now I don't know how far to go with whether we're sort of skirting round spoilers or not, but there's a notorious scene involving Dracula being staked in this movie.
Indeed, yes.
And I love it.
I have no problems with it.
Consensus there doesn't seem to be a consensus on it. I think fans are either in one camp or the other, and I think if you accept this film as one that is constantly having a dig at religion and religious hypocrisy, that scene, again, without going into detail, this scene really, really works, and it really makes sense, and it's a wonderful bit. I mean, Hammer occasionally, as we've said, would take bits from Stoker and try and insert those into the films, but this seems to be a completely original bit of vampire lore, and I think it's fantastic.
Of course, if it's all made up, they were allowed to add new things to it. That was entirely within their right. We may not like it, but it was entirely within their right to do it. And I think, like you say, I think it works really well within the context of the religious aspects of the story. Yeah. And of course, there's a magnificent ending, yet another marvelous climax of it, which we can't discuss because it's, I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that Dracula dies, but it's, I think we have sort of hinted at that.
But again, the activity of the climax sort of has its cake and eats it for this film, because having bashed religion from minute one, we suddenly end with the most religious ending that you can possibly get.
It's completely nuts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just completely insane.
And James Bernard's score just excels. I think it's the best Dracula music that he ever wrote. Is the finale to Dracula.
You could be right. Yes, you could well be right. Yeah, fantastic.
Cool. So should we move on to the next one? We keep plowing through Dracula movies here now, but we'll move on to Taste the Blood of Dracula. No, we get Is this a significant shift?
This one, I think, belongs to that sort of. There was a run of films from sort of the very late 60s into the 70s in British horror, which pitched generation against generation. You can look at a whole load of British horror films at the time. They were mostly, to be fair, written by middle-class, middle-aged men who'd probably never met a young person, but they were always about this struggle between the old guard and the new guard, and this is where Dracula joins in. This is about Dracula trying to take his revenge on the old guard through their children. And so you've got these sort of, in 1969, there were an awful lot of people out there. And I say middle-aged people, they're probably only in their 30s. They were probably still quite young by today's standards, but who were terrified of what the young people were up to. All this rock and roll and drugs and sex and God knows what else they were doing. Sort of Manson had happened by this time. It was all a very scary time to be looking at young people. And so in this film, they actually make them the monsters.
Yeah, but Hammer's genius there is they disguise that by pitching it into Victorian times.
Right. Yeah.
But what that cleverly does is says, what happened then is happening now and will happen 100 years in the future.
Exactly.
So what we've got is a set of young people who are corrupted by Dracula in order for Dracula to expose the hypocrisy of the Victorian upper middle class society. Where we've got these three guys in this little sort of sordid gang who were all sort of successful businessmen or successful community leaders, and the third Friday of every month or whatever they say, they go off to sort of the equivalent of Soho, or it might even be Soho. They sort of go to the big city and indulge themselves with prostitutes and snakes and all kinds of alcoholic beverages and all kinds of weird sinful things, and then they go back home and they abuse their wives and beat their daughters.
On an entirely personal note, I think if my failing memory serves me well enough, I think this was the first Hammer film I partially watched. I remember my parents let me stay up to watch it, and then they got to the bordello scene, and it's like, I think we ought to go to bed now, and that was the end of that. And it took me years to find out what happened. I didn't even get to the point where Dracula was in it. I was so disappointed, But yeah, I mean, and the three. The three, do we call them heroes, the anti-heroes, whatever?
Again, with a Hammer film, it's always so difficult to say,
Again, this moral ambiguity, these upright, sort of members of society doing good things by the sounds of it. From what we can gather, they do good things. Yeah. And then they go and they're absolutely debauched and they're horrible and they murder someone in panic.
They are. They're in their day-to-day lives, they seem to be working for charity. They're doing the very similar sort of to the Frankenstein.
Right. But like you say, it's all about hypocrisy, isn't it? It's all about exposing that Victorian hypocrisy that on the surface everybody was like, oh yeah, we're all very prim and proper, but underneath it they were all just, They were all at it everywhere, and that's that exposed.
But they don't like their kids indulging that.
Of course they do. Of course they do, because they're hypocrites. Of course they do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Was there an element of sort of like the aristocracy and the working classes kind of seeping through?
Yes.
With that, yes, they're doing good work, but ultimately, they're the aristocracy, so they're all corrupt as horrible as any other.
And of course, they're corrupted by someone who's even more aristocratic than they are, who then transforms into someone who's even more aristocratic than he is. So there's sort of levels of
Dracula's showing off his own hypocrisy there.
Right,
and he's not even doing his own killing this time. He's getting the kids to do it for him.
Exactly.
So there's this extraordinary mix in this film. And again, if you want to judge Hammer as possibly even unwittingly, but we've discussed this before. Hammer did seem to lean to the left politically. And I think again, Taste the Blood of Dracula offers yet another example of that. It's a film that is so anti sort of capitalist and exposing that hypocrisy at that level of sort of business and society. and yeah, it's got this weird sort of mix, as you say, where in order to combat that, you have to bring in the Count.
Well, I was just going to say, this must have been very confusing for, the kids who went to see it. They were thinking, oh, yeah, they've got all these young people. It's going to be cool.
We can root for Martin Jarvis and Linda Hayden, but yeah, why is this guy with a title helping?
Exactly, yeah. And Christopher Lee, bless him, he gets even less dialogue than ever here. Most of which he's mostly him going the first. Second, but it's so commanding, isn't it? It's so sort of, when he does appear, it's just like so like, oh my God, it's Christopher Lee.
He's still imperious, and he's still got that confidence you were talking about, even when he's got nothing.
That's right. Yeah, he still owns everything that's going on around him, even though he's just sort of standing there. Really, it's another magnificent performance.
Again, the treatment of Dracula here, though, by Hammer is that we're 50 minutes into a 95-minute film before we see him. Before he turns up. A la Dracula, Prince of Darkness. And then when we do, he's got nothing to do. So,
to be fair, it's a brilliant reappearance. The resurrection of this is one of my favourites. The dust settling over and the crack of thunder in the background. It splits open, and he's under there with the red eyes.
Yeah. When you paid for your ticket in 1970 to go and see this film, and you saw the title Taste the Blood of Dracula, I'm sure a few people sort of looked at that title and thought, what does it mean, Taste the Blood of Dracula? What are we in for? But boy, do you find out.
It's one of those outlandish titles where you think, oh, that's just a come on, isn't it? That's just a come on for the drive-in. But it actually happens in the film. Yeah, it's astonishing. Yeah, great stuff.
We had this at the start of 1970, and then we get, which is one of Kevin's favourite Dracula films, and then at the end of 1970, we get Scars of Dracula.
See, that's why I kept talking, because I was trying to put this off, to be fair.
We don't have to talk too long about this.
Well, it was a double bill with the Frankenstein film that must not be named. And to be honest, they're good bedfellows. They are the pits in both series, to be honest. They're just dreadful films. This is the film where Dracula becomes something entirely different to what we've seen before. He becomes a sadistic monster who's sort of driven into a sexual jealous rage at one point, And he's like, he uses a dagger to kill someone, for God's sake. That's not Dracula's way. It's an awful film. Bless them, the supporting cast do what they can, but the characters are so wet. You just don't give a damn about them.
It all looks very cheap as well, doesn't it? It looks as though it's been made hastily. And we've been talking about Dracula's minutes of screen time here. He gets quite a few minutes of screen time in this one, but he actually gets less than a big, awful looking joke shot rubber bat that flaps in on a string every 10 minutes or so, and that actually gets more screen time, not only than Christopher Lee, than more than just about any other member of the cast. It must have had a better agent.
Don't they mention the early sort of like Dracula movie, either Dracula or Brides of Dracula, about the transfiguration into beasts is don't believe everything you read in the newspapers and the books kind of thing.
Van Helsing says that.
Go back and remember that.
But this throws continuity completely out the window, because we pick up Dracula this time nowhere near where we left him at the end of Taste. He's now in a coffin in a room high up in a tower which hasn't got a door in it, which he's been staked clearly because he's turned to dust. Who the hell got up there? Who put him there? How did what? Right from the very start, you're sitting there scratching your head thinking, well, who killed him and how did they get into that room?
There's this very arbitrary sort of resurrection as well, which is absolutely ridiculous. Again, we won't spoil it for new viewers, but
I don't think we can spoil any of this film, because honestly,
maybe don't
and actually make people go and watch it. But whatever you do, if you're going to start watching Dracula films, make this one the very, very last Hammer Dracula film you watch, because you'll thank us for that. Moving on rapidly.
Yeah, we get to 1972, and it's a seismic change, I guess, for these next two films. It was gone before. Dracula 1972 AD is the next film. And modern times.
Yeah, there's an odd thing going on in vampire cinema at this time, where we're used to, in cinema history, we're used to having single films and we're used to having franchises. There aren't many occasions where you get pairs of films coming out closely together. And yet there were several vampire movies that came out in twos around this time, 1970, 71, 72. There were two films based on the Dan Curtis Dark Shadows TV show. There were two Dracula movies. There were the two Night Stalker and Night Strangler films with Darren McGavin. I think there are a couple of other examples as well. The Count Yorga films. Yeah, we had two of those. And here we are with the British example of that form. So these films work as a pair: Dracula A.D. 72 and Satanic Rites.
I'm here to tell you I will not hear a bad word about Dracula A.D. 1972. It is, having watched only part of Taste of Blood of Dracula, this I'm fairly sure was the first Hammer film I actually watched all the way through. And as a consequence, it has a very special place in my heart. I bloody love it, and I will fight anyone who tells me it's anything less than marvelous. It is absurd in so many ways, but I mean, it is so much fun.
We're talking about the Hammer timeline earlier on, or the Dracula timeline at Hammer, and this film really messes it up, because it starts off with a prologue in 1872. It then flashes forward, which is wonderful. It's a great mini movie. Hammer would seem to be doing this a little bit in their films at the time, because is it Twins of Evil, or one of the vampire films starts off with a little sort of 10-minute vignette at the start before the credits.
Well, I think, this is possibly the Bond influence, isn't it? Where
Vampire Circus it is,
It's Vampire Circus, of course it is,
But talking of Bond influence, though, Kevin, I think what Dracula AD 72 and Satanic Rites do here as a pair, they're within a franchise, but they stand as a pair on their own. And they sort of anticipate what happened with Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace 35 years later. You're within an established franchise, but let's do this little pair that sort of fit together as one story.
And of course, we see the return. Let's not gloss over this. We see the return of Peter Cushing. He's not been in the films since Brides of Dracula, and now he's back as an older descendant of Van Helsing. I have to go with grandson, I think, because I think he'd be quite crotchety if he was his son. But he's still very dynamic. He's still, he's an older man now, but he's still, still out there fighting the fight.
Again, these two films are, again, a perfect example of what you expressed right at the start of the podcast, Kevin, that Dracula has very little to actually do, but just the fact that he's there is enough.
Wreaks absolute havoc without leaving a church.
Not only has Van Helsing got a little helper in the form of is she his granddaughter again? This is so mixed up. But Dracula's got help too.
Yes, although that
Johnny Alucard.
That does lead to the silliest scene in the film where we all know we know that what Alucard means. We got it. We can work it out. We're not stupid. But Van Helsing has clearly lost a few brain cells over the generations and has to actually write it out on a piece of paper and drawing lines. So just in case any thicko in the audience had missed it, it's like, oh, come on, you're better than that.
Just going back to the sort of how they're very much of their time. I think they're fascinating from that point of view. Is that they're very much of their time in a way that maybe the other Dracula films are not of their time. Like the previous Dracula film had no real, you didn't get a swinging 60s kind of vibe, unless you was really looking at the subtext of these films.
That's it. You don't watch Brides of Dracula and think, 1960, but you watch these and think, 1973, man.
And when I said earlier that Brides of Dracula has dated less than some of the later films, this looks positively archaic to modern eyes. I was only 10 when it came out, but I can still remember the times. I can still remember being, I had the hair and the Afghan coat and all the rest of it, And I wonder if, some of my nieces or, the younger people that I know, if they watch this film, they probably look at it the same way we would have looked at a film from the 1930s or 40s when we were watching films in the 70s and 80s. It would have been like so alien to everything we know.
It's it's a world that Edgar Wright has captured in his new film. I think, you know, he's really looked at those British horror movies and British psycho thrillers of that period from the mid 60s through to the early 70s that were set in this world of wimpy bars and coffee bars and discotheques and things like that. And his film Last Night in Soho is pitched sort of towards the start of that period, but it's immersed in that world of British horror, and very successfully too. But these two Hammer films, I think, encapsulate that style as well as anything does, you know. And interestingly, you know, we've been talking about whether, you know, we were talking about Stoker and how Dracula the novel isn't a period piece. Hammer Going Modern are now period pieces.
They are, yes, they're more period pieces than the period pieces, you know, because that's true of anything, isn't it? That, you know, anything that's set in period never really dates. Because you know, but this, you know, it is a real time capsule of a period in British culture which probably never quite happened like this, but we'd all kind of wish that it did. You know, I'd love to hang out with those guys. You know, they're all a bit annoying, but I kind of like to hang out with them because they seem pretty cool. You know, that'd be all right. You know, but marvelous film. I will not hear a bad word about it.
You kind of get those Ealing films where it's like, that's harking back to a period that probably never existed, but it's nice to know that at least it exists on film.
It's cozy, isn't it? Yeah, it has its own coziness now, which is nice. Yeah.
Now we're talking about these films as a pair, but I think we're here in the 2020s recording this, and I think we need to single out Satanic Rites of Dracula because it's a plague movie.
It is a plague movie. Yes.
And what's going on with Dracula here? Because he's planning to unleash plague on the entire planet, kill everyone, and presumably causing his own suicide.
In some ways, I kind of like that. It's almost like he's sort of been around for so long that he's just become weary of existence. And if he's going to go, he's going to take us all with him. Because he's that evil. You know, he can't just sort of give in to Van Helsing and say, look, I've had enough, just stake me and do what you need to do to make sure I come back. Don't come back. He's going to take everybody with him because he's just so evil and nasty.
It's the ultimate sort of expression.
Do you know how we know how evil he is in this film? He's a property developer. That's how evil he is. Yes.
Yeah. I think it was David Pirrie in the Vampire Cinema said, you know, now we know what. Now we know what's happened to London's great white elephant, Centre Point.
Yes. It was Dracula all along. Yeah.
Do we get a feeling that maybe the screenplay's mirroring Christopher Lee's nihilism towards the role at this point? Maybe it's his last outing as Dracula. It's not obviously the nihilism doesn't get much more nihilistic than Gars.
I think he must have been quite relieved seeing the script for this and thinking, at last I get to do no more, you know, and they're finally killing me off for good, you know.
Yeah.
But of course they didn't. And who would have put any money on, of all the actors to replace Christopher Lee in the Hammer Dracula series, who would have put money on the Chinese actor Chan Shen?
I know.
In 1974, there we are.
Yes, he's now Dracula in Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Yeah.
So what's the history of this one and the connection with Hong Kong then?
So before we get into that though, like Hammer have always had sort of like co-production deals for their films.
Oh, of course. All their early films are American co-productions. You know, people don't realize that. They're actually majority American films because the money came from Columbia, Warner, you know, whoever had the money. Yeah.
And of course, there was the big thing we said about the Frankenstein makeup and Universal preventing the use of that until they
until it was a hit and they we're going to have some of this as well.
The little coda we've got to all this, of course, is a script that has been lying about for decades and recently revived by your good pal Kevin, Mr. Jonathan Rigby.
Yes,
tell us a bit about the
unquenchable thirst of Dracula. Well, there were several attempts, weren't there, to make a one last Dracula film. I mean, I think at one point, Carly Bride of Dracula or something, Bride of something, which was going to be set in India. It was going to do for India what Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires they hoped was going to do for the Far East, but it didn't. But no, there was There was this other script, The Unquenchable Thirst of Dracula, which is one of the all-time great horror movie titles. And, somebody should just buy this script just to make the film so that we've got that, just so I can put it on my website and say, look, it exists. It's actually there,
But it has
been produced. It's been produced in sort of rehearsed readings. Where Jonathan and I think Mark Gatiss has done it as well, hasn't he? They've
was it not done as a radio?
He did a radio thing, didn't he? Yeah.
It was done as a 90-minute radio play.
That's right. Yeah. So they've sort of, they know each other. They go back years anyway. So they're all into this sort of stuff. But yeah, this script exists in the Hammer Archive up in Leicester, isn't it? The university up there. Yes, yeah. And it was dragged out of mothballs, dusted down. And I'm ashamed to say I didn't actually get to see the performance. And I'm not quite sure why. Something must have been going on that night. But yeah, it would have been the next one in the series. Carly had sort of fallen by the wayside. I think by then, the writing had been on the wall for Hammer for quite some time. It was all over. They were struggling against, this new wave of American films, which were very modern, very up to date, very contemporary. And then The Exorcist came along and the world of horror changed completely overnight. To a lesser degree, Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well. And it wasn't actually Van Helsing that saw him off. It was this resurgence of modern American horror cinema. And Unquenchable Thirst. It was Leatherface what done it. Yes, as the power of Christ compelled Dracula into an early grave. So sadly, Unquenchable Thirst never got made. Which at that point, I think Hammer were just trying to get anything made. They got To the Devil a Daughter, which was somewhat belated. It was 2 years after Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. They had to go to Germany for the money for that, and there was A Lady Vanishes and nothing until Hammer House of Horror. The market just wasn't there for another traditional Dracula film, sadly. Today, maybe there's some entrepreneurial producer out there can buy the script, and maybe there's enough nostalgia to make that film.
Yeah, but as we say again, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat did their period Dracula last year, and semi successful, I think, and well received by a lot of fans. Yes. So maybe that just showed that the conditions are right for a revival of the Gothic.
It would, but of course the pandemic sort of puts a stop to everything. So I'm hoping, come on, BBC, repeat it and let people look at it and get inspired by the first. Don't worry about the third episode. Just show the first two episodes again and let people get inspired by those, and see if we can get a Gothic revival going with The Unquenchable Thirst. I can't stop saying it. It's such a great title, The Unquenchable Thirst. Put some reverb on when I say this. Unquenchable Thirst of Dracula. I mean, what a marvelous title.
Very good. Well, there we come to the end of Dracula's journey. There's no more resurrections so far. Certainly not one with Christopher Lee playing the role. But yes, thank you for joining us, Kevin. Thank you, Daryl, once again. And thank you for listening. We will be back in another couple of weeks' time with another great podcast. Do check out our Facebook page. Do subscribe to our Patreon if you so wish, where we do extra podcasts on a monthly basis. And we will see you again in 2 weeks' time. Take care.